Again, I didn't concern myself with whether the responses of women and men were shaped by sex or gender. That is, whether they'd been altered by the gendered expectations on how to behave in stressful situations. Men may be expected to conceal their emotions or even put up a fight in order not to lose face, in accordance with a macho ideal. Whereas in Western culture, it's considered more appropriate for women to express insecurity or fear. Rather, my goal was to see whether in each individual brain, stress-induced changes were consistently typical of women or of men, or whether brains showed a patchwork of responses, some changes being typical of women and others typical of men. It is usually hard to compare how the brains of women and men change in response to stress, because to address this question, one would need to scan numerous brains before and after a stressful event. Yet scans conducted prior to such events are rarely available. But my colleagues and I managed to identify a group of people in whom before and after scans had been performed. We learned that a team of neuroscientists from Tel Aviv University had completed a study in which they had scanned the brains of 34 female and male Army paramedics at the beginning of their Army service and about 3 years later. All the soldiers, females and males alike, had been exposed to at least one highly stressful event during that period. They witnessed grave casualties and treated patients with severe injuries in the course of a war. True, it wasn't a perfect experimental setup, because the study design was not controlled in the same way it is with laboratory animals. And yet, because one doesn't induce extreme degrees of stress in human beings for the sake of scientific inquiry, it seemed to be as good as it gets for a study in humans. After establishing a collaboration with the colleagues who had performed the scans, we looked for brain regions in which the response to stress differed between men and women. We found that the volume of many regions had indeed changed at the end of that stressful period. But surprisingly, in most regions, these changes were similar in the two sexes. I say surprisingly because in discussions of the stress response in women and men, it is usually the differences that are being highlighted. Next, we focused on the 7 regions that did change differently in women and men. For example, after the stressful Army service, the volume of a part of the corpus callosum typically decreased in women, but increased in men. The volume of the paracalcerine cortex, one of the visual regions in the brain, also typically increased in men, but stayed the same in women. And the volume of the inferior parietal lobule, a brain region involved in visual perception, including the perception of emotions, typically decreased in men, but stayed the same in women. We then examined the brains one by one to determine, for each individual, whether each of these regions changed in a way typical of males or females. Only in 1 soldier out of the 34 had all of the brain regions responded to stress in a consistent manner. They all showed a female typical response. In contrast, in the brains of 25 soldiers, some regions responded in a way typical of females, while other regions responded in a way typical of males. In the brains of the other 8 soldiers, some regions responded in a way that wasn't typical of either females or males. The remaining regions either all responded in a way that was typical of females, or all responded in a way that was typical of males. Our findings suggest that at least in what concerns brain structure, there is no such thing as a female or a male response to stress. Rather, each person reacts to stress with a unique mosaic of changes. In our study, we didn't try to establish how this mosaic comes about. Each soldier's unique response could have been the result of his or her genes, hormones, experiences, personality, and myriad other factors. And that's precisely the point I want to make. The effects of a person's sex interact with so many contributing factors that despite the average sex differences in the response to stress, it's impossible to tell in advance how each of the regions in one's brain will respond to stress just by knowing that this person is female or male. Nor is it possible to tell in advance, based on a person's sex alone, what to expect on a blind date, as we've already seen. As I discuss in further chapters, we also can't determine which medical treatments will work best for a given person.